All right, it's 1:01 p.m. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for joining us today for Why America Should Go Big on Offshore Wind. My name is Johanna Newman. I'm the Senior Director of the Campaign for 100% Renewable Energy at Environment America Research and Policy Center. And we are a policy and action group whose mission is to protect our natural world. We envision a greener, better America, one that restores and protects more places where all life can thrive, and that offers us and our children the opportunity to live healthier, more enriching lives. I'm really delighted to MC today's event, which is co-sponsored by Environment America Research and Policy Center and the New England for Offshore Wind Coalition. Our goals today are to focus attention on and generate enthusiasm for offshore wind in America, and arm all the attendees with easy to understand information so that you can counter mis or disinformation if you encounter it, and take collective political action to help America reach its offshore wind potential. So toward those goals, here's our agenda. I'll start by outlining some of the benefits of offshore wind, and then Kelt Wilska, the offshore wind director for the New England for Offshore Wind Coalition, will walk through the current state of offshore wind in America. After that, we're delighted to have Sabrina Schenkman, a climate reporter from the Boston Globe, here to share about some of her reporting on offshore wind in a fireside chat. And then we'll go to Alex Goldstein from 90 West with some tips on communicating and messaging around offshore wind. From there, we'll turn it back over to all of you who came here today to gauge your interest in doing a follow-up small group session where you can work on talking about offshore wind to folks in your community. And then we'll take collective political action before we get into our office hours, at which point we'll stop the recording of the webinar and give you a chance to ask questions that you may have about offshore wind. So that's our plan. If you have questions, we ask that you use the Q&A function, which you can find in the taskbar of your Zoom platform at the bottom of your screen. I think that's it for housekeeping. So let's go ahead and get started on the content. And I'll kick things off with a little bit of context about why America needs offshore wind. I'll start by outlining the immense problems that we face. In a nutshell, those problems stem from America being too reliant on dirty sources of energy like coal, oil, and gas. When we extract, transport, burn, and dispose of the waste products from fossil fuels, we pollute our air, our land, and our water. That pollution makes us sick, and it's dangerously warming our planet with potentially catastrophic consequences. Thankfully, there are lots of solutions that can end our dependence on dirty fossil fuels. Today, we can power our lives with renewable energy more affordably and efficiently than ever before in human history. And the sooner that we start soaking up the sun on our rooftops and the wind blowing at our backs, the better it's going to be for our health, for our environment, and our planet. So America has abundant renewable energy potential, including abundant offshore wind potential. And this slide shows an infographic based on data from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory that Environment America Research and Policy Center compiled in our 2021 report, We Have the Power. In the light blue circle on the left-hand side of your screen, you can see a visual representation of how much electricity our nation consumed in 2020, 3.7 gigawatt hours of electricity. And on the right-hand side of the screen, in the green circle, you can see the technical potential of offshore wind to meet our energy needs. The takeaway from this slide is that America has abundant offshore wind potential, and that offshore wind alone could more than meet the electricity demands that the nation had in 2020. The other thing that's important to know about the abundance of offshore wind is that it is an energy source that a bunch of regions around America can use. In total, 29 states have the potential to generate offshore wind energy. That same report, We Have the Power, that Environment America put out in 2021, looked at the regional offshore wind potential. And I want to just briefly break this down. So on this slide, for the four key regions of the country, the Atlantic, the Pacific, the Gulf of Mexico, and the Great Lakes, we broke down 2019 electricity usage, the technical potential of offshore wind in that region, and then how much electricity that region is projected to use under a scenario where by 2050, we electrify all energy use in our homes and our businesses, as well as in the transportation sector. And so on the top, you can see that the Atlantic region will roughly have electricity demand double under a scenario where we electrify everything, but that offshore wind is so abundant in the region that it could more than meet those electricity needs. In the Pacific, a full scenario where we electrify everything will more than double electricity usage. And offshore wind can't meet all of that electricity demand, but it can certainly play a significant role. In the Gulf of Mexico, electricity demand also would double under a scenario where we electrify everything, but the region has enough offshore wind potential to meet all those electricity needs and then some. And then in the Great Lakes, offshore wind is less present than on the ocean and the Gulf coasts, but offshore wind right now could meet close to half of the region's electricity demand if the potential was maximized. Here's the national picture for offshore wind's technical capability. So offshore wind currently could more than power the nation under a scenario where we electrify all electricity usage or all energy use in the United States. It can't meet all of the needs, but again, can make a very significant contribution. So that's a little bit on the abundance of offshore wind. I want to talk about two other benefits of maximizing our offshore wind potential as quickly as possible. The first is that offshore wind is convenient. What I mean by that is that roughly 40% of the American population lives in counties on the coast of an ocean or on a Great Lake. And that means that power generated by offshore wind doesn't have to travel very far to where it's needed. That averts the need for costly long-distance transmission infrastructure, and it reduces the amount of energy that's lost in transmission, making it very efficient. The second key reason that, I missed a slide. Or a second key attribute of offshore wind is that it is reliable. So wind on the water tends to be really strong and really consistent. And offshore wind is actually strongest during the winter and during the afternoon and evening hours. That makes it a perfect complement to solar production, which has its peak production during the sunny, hot afternoon hours. And I want to come back to the winter months and the fact that offshore wind is strongest during the winter months. In regions like New England, where our energy demand increases with the winter heating season, offshore wind is poised to just play a leading role in our transition to 100% renewable energy because it blows strongest during the winter and in the afternoon and the evening when it's coldest. I'll end my presentation by just saying that offshore wind technology is improving. This slide shows a figure produced by the Federal Environmental Protection Agency, and it shows the increase in technology and in size of wind turbines. So in the 1990s, most wind turbines were roughly 98 feet tall and were able to produce about 0.2 megawatts of power. Fast forward to 2016, where offshore wind turbines can produce 6 megawatts of power, and they're taller than the Statue of Liberty. And the technology keeps improving, and the larger the wind turbine is, the more efficient it is at producing power. And I'll share that the turbines that Avangrid is using to build the Vineyard Wind project off the coast of Massachusetts uses GE's Haliade X turbines, which in under 7 seconds can produce enough power to serve an average American home for an entire day. That gives you a sense of just how powerful these machines are and how effective they are at capturing the wind to make it electricity we can use to power our lives. So, given all those benefits and those attributes, The way I see it is every day we feel the wind at our backs, and we should be wondering how much longer we want to keep paying the price for burning dirty coal, oil, and gas when we could just be harnessing the wind at our backs. With that, I'd like to hand it over to Kelt to give us an overview of the current state of affairs of offshore wind in America. Go ahead, Kelt.
Thank you so much, Johanna, and thank you everybody for being here today. It's a delight to be here. My name is Kelt Wilska. I'm the Offshore Wind Director at the Environmental League of Massachusetts, where I lead the New England for Offshore Wind Coalition, a group of 100+ organizations. We're growing all the time. Environmental nonprofits, labor unions, educational institutions, and business associations all working together to make sure that offshore wind is developed responsibly and equitably off of our region's coast. So before I zoom in to the state of play, I want to actually zoom out for a second and kind of set the stage here a bit globally. So as most of you know, I hope, we have a big problem. It's called climate change. Our combustion of fossil fuels around the globe is contributing to the warming of our planet. And if we don't change what we're doing, we're going to pass the point of no return. And we need to keep that global temperature below 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is the global goal that we have set. And so the United States is doing its part via the Biden administration to meet that global goal. And so part of the way in which we're doing this is setting a goal for installed offshore wind capacity. The Biden administration has set a goal of 30 gigawatts of installed offshore wind by 2030, and also 15 extra gigawatts of floating offshore wind by 2045. So, or 2035, I'm sorry. That's 45 gigawatts total of offshore wind. So in this total of 45 gigawatts lies tremendous potential for both our environment and our economy. And it's honestly what gets me excited about offshore wind every single day. These turbines, like Johanna said, are feats of human ingenuity. They're some of the biggest machines that humankind has ever built. So we're basically approaching this huge problem with a huge solution. I'll dive into a case study for a second. The Gulf of Maine, where I spend a lot of my time, is warming faster than 99% of the world's oceans. So it is a victim of the climate crisis, but also it can be a solution to the climate crisis by harnessing some of the strongest winds in the world that are found there. So we're solving a big problem with a very big solution. I live in Boston. When I go out for a walk in the morning, I see the Prudential Center looming above me. It's 750 feet tall. I'm going to Vineyard Wind 1 in a week to see the turbines that are being installed out there. There are currently 16 of them. They are 800 feet tall. So I'm going to be out there with 16 Prudential Centers sticking out of the water, generating clean, reliable electricity that's going into our grid and powering, by the end of the year, we'll be powering 400,000 homes. It's a sight to behold. So, but first, we got to build these things. And when I look at the designs for these enormous machines, I can really only think of one thing, and that is how many good-paying, family-sustaining union jobs this industry is going to create and is already creating, from fabrication, the manufacturing, to the assembly, to the installation that's happening in the ocean right now, to the operations and maintenance. And of course, ports need to be built to put these things together, and that means even more union jobs and also a stronger supply chain for the United States. Making more things here is better. So, for example, when a port gets built in Searsport, Maine, where the governor has designated the first floating offshore wind port in the nation to be, an iron worker isn't going to have to drive 3 hours down to Boston for a good paying job. Instead, they're just going to have a great job in their community, and they can go home after work to have dinner with their families. That's really what this is all about, is tying the economic benefits to fighting climate change at the same time. So this industry is going to revitalize and transform our local communities with tremendous investments. Developers are ready and willing, as they've already shown in certain communities in New England, to sign historic community benefits agreements with towns and cities that host port and electrical transmission infrastructure, providing significant investments in community resources. And that will really depend on what the community needs and wants. It's articulated by the community members themselves. And this can include workforce training programs to public infrastructure projects like bike paths and wastewater system upgrades. The city of Salem, Massachusetts just signed a historic community benefits agreement with a port developer where they're going to turn an old piece of fossil fuel infrastructure property into a state-of-the-art offshore wind port that can put together these turbines and service these massive machines that are going to get put out in the ocean, put them all together. So turbines are being installed off of New England's coast, and states are committing to more and more offshore wind electricity. We've got a procurement bill up in Maine for 3 gigawatts by 2040. We've got currently a tri-state solicitation for offshore wind in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. That is an ongoing process, and bids will be selected on August 7th. So that's a really brand new model for buying electricity together as a group of states to do it more efficiently and cost effectively. We're looking forward to seeing how that process unfolds. And of course, the federal government is preparing to lease more parcels in our federal waters. Secretary Holland, just a couple months ago, the Department of the Interior announced a 5-year leasing schedule for offshore wind in federal waters. That's going to be everywhere from the Central Atlantic to the Gulf of Maine to Hawaii to California. It's going to be everywhere to the Gulf of Mexico. We're going to have offshore wind all around our country. And so this is continuing to happen, and we're going strong. It sends a strong signal to developers that we mean business in the United States. So we're at the beginning of a transformative moment in our history where we're thinking big to fight climate change and turbocharge our economy with union jobs and community investments and supply chain investments. And so how does our coalition play into this? So like I said, we're a group of 100+ organizations from all different parts of the advocacy spectrum, right? We're environmentals, we're labor unions, we're universities, we're business groups. We're all working together and playing our part to do different things and support these efforts that are ongoing at the federal level, at the state level, at the regional level. We have 6 different state committees, one for each New England state. Even Vermont is doing great work right now to work on regional procurements of offshore wind to get electricity up to their state to meet their, hopefully soon, 100% renewable energy standard. But we have folks in our coalition working at all different levels, right, to pass legislation that increases states' commitments to purchasing offshore wind electricity. We're doing federal advocacy to the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management to make sure that these leases are sited and planned responsibly. And also, a big part of our coalition is sharing the best available science and data that counters the mis and disinformation that is running rampant right now and getting in the way of us meeting our climate goals and bringing all these fantastic union jobs and community investments to our country. We're educating communities along the way about the many, many opportunities that this industry can bring. And so I'll close with that. I'll invite you to join us in our work to make sure that offshore wind gets to every single community in our country, and that all the benefits can be distributed around the United States. So thank you very much, and I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much, Kelt. Thanks so much for joining us, and Kelt's information is on this slide here. I'll leave it up for a minute while I introduce Sabrina Shankman. So I'm really looking forward to my conversation with Sabrina. Sabrina is one of the climate reporters at the Boston Globe and has been covering offshore wind as a beat for a number of years. Sabrina, can you turn on your video?
My video is on.
Video is on. Okay. Oh, yes, there you are. Okay, great. So I guess, Sabrina, can we just kick things off and have you share a little bit about how important offshore wind is to Massachusetts to meet its climate goals, and then potentially even the national picture?
Sure. Although I am seeing on the chat that they can only see Kelt currently. Is there a view change, perhaps?
I think so. All right.
There I am, at least.
Thank you.
So, yeah, I mean, offshore wind is crucial. I've done a lot of reporting on what has to happen to the power grid in order for Massachusetts to achieve its clean energy goals and get to where it needs to go based on its climate laws that say it will get to net zero by 2050 and will also cut emissions in half compared to 1990 levels by the end of this decade. So what that requires is really a patchwork of different kinds of energy sources coming together, hydroelectric, solar, but the big driver is offshore wind. Really, that is kind of the powerhouse, because where solar kind of is making great progress, it's pecking away, one small project at a time. Massachusetts is not a place where there's major, industrial wind farms necessarily. Not a lot of them, at least. But with every offshore wind farm, there can be a big chunk of our energy needs that are met suddenly. So it's really crucial. The thing that has been interesting in the years that I've been covering this at the Boston Globe is to see how the tides have kind of turned on offshore wind. There's so much enthusiasm for this as an energy source, but there are also incredible challenges that have resulted in things slowing down. So the reality is, like, we're in a tough spot. If we're going to get to where Massachusetts needs to go based on its climate law by 2030, things really, really have to speed up pretty quickly.
And what do you see as the key hurdles that offshore wind is facing that are slowing it down right now?
It's money, right? It's always money. I mean, the big hurdle is that in the last couple of years, with interest rates, with supply chain issues, the cost of offshore wind really went through the roof. And so suddenly projects that were in progress were no longer economically feasible. What that resulted in was, while, the Vineyard Wind project was already well on its way, there are, I think, 16 turbines up now. And Kelt, I'll actually be going, I think I'm going on that trip with you next week. I was supposed to go yesterday, but the weather was bad for the trip. But yeah, so that's happening. But the other projects that were close to, starting construction, the math just wasn't mathing. It just didn't work out. And so they have had to subsequently go back out to bid in hopes of getting a rate that is more in line with what the costs will actually be. So that set things back. The state has every intention of making sure that once things are back on track, they are able to go as quickly as possible to facilitate that and keep things kind of moving steadily ahead. But it has been a challenge for sure.
Right. You have written in your reporting about some of the coordination between fossil fuel interests and local groups in Massachusetts opposed to offshore wind, and specifically in relation to whale deaths and transmission lines going either through wilderness areas or under beaches. Could you just dig into that reporting a little bit and tell us how that coordination works and how effective it's been at impeding offshore wind growth, and just kind of shine a spotlight into some of this misinformation that is starting to emerge?
Yeah. Well, a lot of what I know, or at least the root of what I've learned about this, started with some research that was done out of Brown University, where they've really taken a long and deep look into some of these kind of this web of misinformation. And what they have shown through their work is that there appears to be a coordination where some kind of right-wing think tanks that are very kind of clear that they are opposed to clean energy policies. Some of them receive or have received funding from fossil fuel interests in the past. Many of them don't disclose their funding, so it's, you can find out about nuggets of information about where they've received that funding years ago, but we don't have a clear picture into that now. But those groups have coordinated with some local groups that are then putting out information trying to tie the death of whales to offshore wind, trying to helping provide some financial support for lawsuits that aim to slow down the expansion of offshore wind, largely in the name of whales. I mean, the messaging tends to be that you say there hasn't been an adequate environmental review of this offshore wind project that spent years in environmental review, and the whales are not adequately protected, and therefore this project should not be allowed to go forward. I mean, that's sort of the basis for a lot of the legal concerns that have been raised. But there's, it's not totally clear where the intention comes from. I mean, there appears to be this coordination. We know this because there are some individuals who kind of are in multiple groups and also have some backing in some of these think tanks. There's also a lot of the same kind of messaging, like specific visuals that are repeated from group to group to group. There are coalitions that these groups are all part of, which is not to say that everyone who is a member of these groups is like on the take, twirling their mustaches, how do we stop offshore wind? I think there are a lot of actually very well-intentioned people who hear this message. They see it on Facebook, they see it on social media that says offshore wind is bad for whales, that, you know, these sounds in the ocean, you know, we know everyone learns in elementary school about whales and sonar. This is bad for whales, it's killing them. And then they hear a whale died. And they get concerned, they join a group, and a lot of people, to be honest, are not on, you know, a webinar learning about offshore wind. They don't have a lot of time in their day. And so you hear something, it sort of tracks with what makes sense, and maybe you hit a like or a share and the message kind of goes out farther. But the problem is these messages catch on like wildfire. So increasingly, I mean, it is true, there have been a tremendous number of whales that have died just this year. I mean, it feels like there's always just headline after headline after headline about whale deaths.
Right,
Now,
but it's what is the actual cause of the whale deaths?
right. So that's the thing. I've spoken with lots of scientists who have spent their entire careers, decades and decades long careers, looking specifically at whale mortality, whale species off the Atlantic coast. And what they have said is that there has never been a necropsy on a whale older than 1 year old that has said anything other than a ship strike or an illness, entanglement. I mean, they are the same kinds of things happening over and over again. So yes, it's very easy to say whales are dying, it must be wind, because offshore wind is being developed for the first time. But if you take a little bit of a longer view, a little bit of a wider lens on it, you can also say the oceans are hotter than they have ever been before. Shipping during COVID, as people were clicking and ordering and clicking and ordering, we know there are ships traveling more frequently and faster into all these different ports. There are all these other threats that truly do endanger whales that need to be addressed. But to say it's the offshore wind that's causing it, there's just no science that shows that. I mean, scientists are looking for it. They are saying, look, this is new. We haven't done this before. We have to take precautions. There could be risks to whales. And so, you know, those kind of frameworks are being introduced by the federal government, by different research organizations, aquariums, you name it. But so far, there is no reason to believe that that is indeed a cause of whale death.
There's an interesting strategic dilemma for clean energy advocates and ocean advocates, even trying to figure out how much to focus on debunking the myths and how much we should be trying to win over community members who are inclined to be opposed or skeptical to offshore wind, under the fear that if you engage, you risk giving those efforts more oxygen. Based on your reporting, how do you see that dynamic playing out? And are there potentially cautionary tales that folks should be aware of?
Yes. So back in the fall, I got an email from someone in Barnstable who said, hey, Sabrina, I know you cover climate change in the Boston Globe, wondering if you might want to come out to Barnstable. We are mad. There is this plan to land all these cables from offshore wind under our beaches. We've got a big community meeting going on, hundreds of people coming out. Why don't you come take a look? And I was like, okay, that sounds really interesting. Like I hadn't heard about that level of opposition previously. You know, I've heard about individual groups with a handful of members, but here what he was saying was hundreds of residents had signed a petition to get this meeting, to get answers because they were worried. So I talked to a couple advocates before I went, and they were sort of like aware of it vaguely, but like not generally concerned. You know, I didn't feel like nobody was saying this is a big problem, like so glad you're going out there, we need coverage of this, whatever. I went because it sounded like an interesting story, and I gotta say, pretty astounded by the level of concern that I heard at that meeting. I mean, these were folks who were pretty mad about the idea that there was going to be cables going under their beaches. There were, I don't know, 400 or 500 people that were filled this room. You know, there were some people, to be clear, who were there in support of offshore wind, But there were also a lot of people that had not received particularly good information, despite all the best efforts from Avangrid and the town to provide that information and provide venues to receive it. What they were hearing was that there was going to be dangerous electromagnetic fields that were going to be going under popular, beloved beaches, that their roads were going to be ripped apart, that would be no community benefit to them whatsoever, that there would be dangerous levels of electricity traveling under their roads or over their heads, that their children would be growing up facing these big risks, and this place that was beloved to them would be destroyed. Now, there's no reason to believe that, right? There are places all over the world where there are undersea cables that land at beaches, and it has not been a problem. But and in fact, there were already undersea cables that had been constructed under one of these beaches, and I went there, and it was a beautiful beach. People were swimming, the sun was setting, it was gorgeous. There was no sign that anything had been built there except for a new manhole cover that I knew to look for, but you as a resident of Barnstable would have no idea what you were seeing. But it didn't matter. The amount of concern that was there was so kind of eye-opening to me, because these people were also trying to create some momentum at the Energy Facility and Sightings Board, which is a state entity that has to approve permits for things, to try to hold back those undersea cables from being able to be the next ones from being able to be constructed. They were trying to slow down the kind of long bureaucratic process so that this wouldn't happen. And that's what's so kind of insidious about this, is these are well-meaning people with real concerns, but they're really going off of information that's not really grounded in science. It's stuff that gives you a visceral response, but it can have the impact of slowing things down. And so to me, it said that looking away, if you're someone who cares about offshore wind and wants to see it developed, looking away was not making this go away. It was this movement was growing, and I believe that it's growing in other places too, just based on the kind of strong response I've seen to a lot of my offshore wind stories, where, you know, I'm still being dragged all over Twitter for everything that I've written and being accused of wanting to kill whales and you name it, because there is this whole machinery around opposing offshore wind.
You had talked about some of the visuals being consistent across communities. Can you talk a little bit about what those look like? Because I feel like in my experience driving around New England, I'm seeing signage that's clearly related to offshore wind. Are there specific things that you've...
Well, the stuff that gets passed around online, it tends to be like there's this one infographic about just like about so showing like the silhouette of a windmill and how the sounds of sonar exploration can affect whales. It's just like they're just very kind of simple illustrations, but when you see them repeated over and over again, that sort of says something to you. Like, could it be that these groups are spontaneously creating exactly the same visual? No, that is very unlikely. And then, you know, and then there's also what you see out in the physical world too. You know, I saw it visiting family in South Jersey last year. I saw it out in Barnstable too. There's a lot of lawn signs about, you know, protect our view, protect our shores, save the whales, stop the development. And, you know, people are more likely to put up a sign that is saying stop this than they are to say go wind, because there's just not the same imperative.
Even though those of us paying attention to climate change know that there is an urgent imperative.
Of course, but things are moving already in the direction of offshore wind. When you go out to Cape Cod, like there are projects that are in the works. So I think if you are someone who cares about offshore wind, you can feel like, okay, this is happening. Like the state's on board. We've got these great bids. Everything's moving in the right direction. Good to go. But there are also these people trying to gum up the works, and they saw how they were able to do that with Cape Wind years ago. There's reason to believe, you know, make a stink and you can slow things down.
I have two more questions. So the first is, at the end of March, we saw a really kind of unique and exciting arrangement come out of Boston City Hall, where Mayor Wu said that the city is going to purchase energy directly from Avangrid for offshore wind projects in Massachusetts. Do you know, can you tell us more about that arrangement? where things stand, how it came to be, and if it's a model that other municipalities could use?
Yeah. Yeah. I thought that was really cool when I heard about it. So basically, there was the next round of bids were coming in for offshore wind projects. And this included rebidding some of those projects that had been slowed down previously that we discussed before. But this time, the city of Boston was essentially saying to Avangrid, if you get approved, we will be responsible for essentially buying one turbine's worth of wind. So about 15 megawatts, if I have that right, gigawatts. Oh gosh, I'm on the spot and I'm going to get the watts.
Megawatts.
Gigawatts. Thank you. And so the idea is that that is enough energy to offset a lot of what's created by Boston Public Schools. It's enough energy that it could help contribute to Boston's very progressive clean energy, clean electricity buying program, which allows residents to purchase clean electricity for a lower rate than they would if they were buying electricity directly from their utility. So there's a lot of kind of exciting parts of it. So basically, Avangrid has put two bids out for projects. We'll hear in early August about which of the bids that were submitted will be approved. If either of the bids that Avangrid put in is approved, then this will go forward. And yeah, I think the city of Boston is hoping like that they can position themselves as a leader on this and say, look, let's be creative. We need more clean energy in our city. Other cities do too. Like, why sit and wait for the state procurement process and wait for it to go this way when we could actually be a player in this, be working and trying to help make sure that offshore wind gets developed. It's like a putting your money where your mouth is approach. Interesting.
And so I imagine there are other coastal cities that might be looking to Boston as a potential example.
I think that's what Boston's hoping. I've not spoken with other cities to hear that that's happening, but they're hoping to kind of lead by example for sure.
Great. Well, Sabrina, thanks so much for joining us. I have one last question for our conversation, which is, we have ambitious goals as a nation. 30 gigawatts of offshore wind up and running by 2030 was the goal that the Biden administration put out. Massachusetts and many other states have their own ambitious in-state offshore wind procurement goals. If you had a crystal ball, based on what you know in your reporting, what do you see as the prospects for offshore wind 5 years from now, 7 years from now in 2030? Like, what are the challenges that remain? And then what actions can citizens and policymakers and businesses take?
Okay, so as a journalist, I can't really tell you what steps to take, but I can tell you that a lot is going to hinge on what happens with the election. We saw during the Trump administration what that meant for offshore wind and all sorts of clean energy policies, which was that things, if anything that requires a national approval, which is the case with offshore wind, but really kind of ground to a halt, or backtracked, right? There were plenty of things that states, cities, corporations, nonprofits were doing to continue to move climate progress forward. And that's why we're in a better position now than we certainly would have been had that not happened during the past Trump administration. But it's trickier with offshore wind. So in my reporting now, what I'm hearing is that it is so important to try to get through as much good policy right now that will kind of take things from the federal to the state level to make sure that things are moving forward as expeditiously as possible. Because if Trump is elected, that could obviously really change things. If Biden's elected, it's a different story. Obviously, the Biden administration has been very clear about the significance of offshore wind as, a lever for driving clean energy. And I think we'll just see that continue. I think especially as hopefully more solutions are figured out to make sure that the bids for offshore wind are in line with the economics of the time so that things are not slowed down in the way that they were in the last couple of years. So, it's the crystal ball is not particularly clear because there are two very different paths ahead of us.
All right. Thanks so much for sharing from your reporting, Sabrina, and for joining us today. Really
Thanks
appreciate
for having me.
You bet. All right. I am going to shift around the spotlight here and elevate Alex Goldstein. Alex, we're thrilled to have you here today. For those who have not met Alex before, Alex was the spokesperson for Governor Deval Patrick when he was in office in Massachusetts, and now is the CEO of 90 West, a strategic communications firm who works with a lot of clients working to advance offshore wind. So Alex, with that introduction, take it away.
Thank you so much, Johanna, and thanks everybody for being here. And actually, I got to say, it gives me a lot of hope that it's almost 2 p.m. Eastern time in the middle of the week in Massachusetts, and there's 132 people on a webinar to talk about offshore wind. That's a good sign. Particularly excited to be joining two folks I've worked with over recent months with Kelt and Sabrina from the Boston Globe, who I've worked with on many different stories over the last couple of years. In some ways, I think you're doing this cadence just right, which is you're getting yourself armed with the facts and what's true and what isn't, and the substance of what is actually happening in the United States on offshore wind. And I think my role as a communicator and someone who does communicating professionally is to think about what do we do with this information and how do we actually package it and deliver it to the audiences that need to hear it and help to actually persuade people and engage with people who may disagree with us on these issues. And so, as Johanna mentioned, my background is I spent about a decade with Governor Patrick in Massachusetts. What's interesting is I heard a reference to Cape Wind earlier, which was a failed wind project that was a little bit, I guess you could argue, before its time, but also was undercut significantly by the Koch brothers, who did not want it to be successful. And my, in a lot of ways, my original work on clean energy when I was a spokesman for Governor Patrick and the administration was a lot of losses on clean energy. I learned a lot about what wasn't working, and now to be sort of back in the fold on clean energy and trying to advance communications that continue to move clean energy forward and the clean energy transition forward, it's like a whole new day in so many ways. There's so many exciting things that are happening. And I think where I try to focus my energy, and many of our clients that we work with at my firm are really focused on, how do we bring more people into the fold? How do we persuade policymakers and stakeholders that the investments and the policy changes necessary to be a part of this massive transition to clean energy, whether it's offshore wind or solar or battery storage or any number of issues related to clean energy, how do we bring people along with us? How do we get people galvanized and organized? How do we make volunteers want to really focus on this? How do we bring in private sector and philanthropic funds and government funds to invest in these initiatives and make things happen? And so most of my day is spent either talking to journalists and working with them on different stories around clean energy, or working with our clients to help them figure out how to find the words that they're looking for to tell their own stories. And, as I mentioned, I think it's really important that as you're kind of grappling with this question of how do we do persuasive communications around offshore wind with the various audiences that we may want to work with, the first step is grounding yourself in the reality and the fact and what the story is. And that's why I think events like this webinar are so important. And I think from there are some really basic building blocks that I wanted to talk about today that you can use in your own advocacy work that will make you a more effective communicator and help optimize your communications, regardless of who your audience is. And I think I thought I'd walk you through a little bit about the model of how I think about approaching communications when I'm trying to either persuade elected officials or to tell stories in the media. I think there's really 3 places we need to start. First is to be really crystal clear about who is the audience that we really need to reach, and what is it that they really need to hear from us. What are the attributes of the audiences we want to talk to? Trying to speak to elected officials, for example, is a different audience than trying to galvanize your friends and neighbors. Trying to speak to people who we know are supportive to make them more active and a part of our movement is a different conversation than talking to people that we know are opposed to us or maybe disagree and trying to convince them that they ought to reconsider some of those positions. So I think the first thing we need to do is be really clear. Who is it that we're trying to talk to and why? Why have we chosen them as our audience? The second piece then, of course, is what do we want to say to them? What is the message to those folks that we believe can be persuasive? And I'll get back to that in just a moment. And then the last piece is what is the actual vehicle that we want to use to convey our messages. So there's been a lot of references today, for example, to using social media as a tool to get information out to people and get people sharing content. That's obviously one tool that's at our disposal, but there's so many other ways to do communications. And guess what? One of the single best ways, it may not be the most efficient, but truly, I'm a grassroots organizer originally. That was my first ever job in politics. And one thing I learned then is that the most effective way to persuade people about anything is person to person, looking somebody in the eye and having a conversation, sitting around at a kitchen table or at a coffee shop. And I think all of those different settings, we want to think about what is the right vehicle to communicate what we want people to know about offshore wind. Maybe it is a blog, or maybe it's doing media interviews or writing an op-ed or things like that. When it comes to the message, though, I think there are a couple things that we can really try to hone in on to make our messages about how we talk about offshore wind stronger. Throughout my career, I've really seen one through line, which is that the most persuasive communications really happens at this nexus point between emotion and credibility. We have to find a way to connect with people emotionally, or they will be less likely to really pay attention to what we're trying to say and connect with us, right? Like, this is a basic human thing that when we're emotional beings, and when people talk to us in a way that resonates with us emotionally, we can be connected to it. I always joke that, I'm the kind of person that might like cry at a commercial that they see on TV, and like, I'm just drawn in and I got tears running down my face. I'm like, what is this commercial? And it turns out it's like an insurance company or something, right? But that insurance company running that ad knows that if they connect with me emotionally, I'm along for the ride. I'm going to pay attention. Now, I might be a little disappointed at the end when I find out that that's what they were trying to sell me on, but emotion is key. And so the question to ask yourself is, if you are interested in advocating on the issue of offshore wind, what is your emotional connection point? And I'll come back to this in a second and talk about my own, but what is your emotional resonance with this issue? The sort of yin and yang between emotion is then credibility. And credibility is the science, the data points, all of the research that has been done over and over and over again to try to give us hard numbers. So many different organizations and so many capacities have built this treasure trove of real data, so that when we go out and have these conversations, not only are we connecting with people emotionally, but we also have the facts, the data that underlies it, so we're believable, right? Because one thing about emotional communication is that it can be unbelievably powerful, but it can also feel manipulative or exploitative if we're just kind of pulling at people's heartstrings, but there's no substance. And so credibility is the substance of that. And those two need to work together, the data points and the emotion, to be able to start to tell a real story, and merging those all together. And I think one of the things that I've found is that the most effective communication doesn't usually happen at 30,000 feet up in the clouds, reading talking points and abstract bullets about how to win the argument on offshore wind. Yes, I want to know those. Those are important. I need to internalize what the arguments are. But the real magic is actually when we bring it down to street level and we can do storytelling about people and places and things that animate it and that bring it to life. But for me personally, I said this notion of how do we make it personal? My old boss, Governor Patrick, used to talk about this all the time. How do we make policy personal? He had this line that said, policy only matters at the point where it touches people. And it has stayed with me throughout my entire career. And, for me, so people ask me, Alex, why you have the firm, you got 8 employees, you're doing all this work, why are you focused on clean energy and climate? And I have the easiest, most emotional answer in the world to that question, which is, I am the first-time dad to a daughter who's going to turn 1 year old on Friday. And all I can think about since the day that she was born and leading up to her being born was, what kind of world am I going to leave to my beautiful daughter, Ava? And when I see her and I think about, Kelt was referring to 1.5 degrees of warming. We work with a group of climate research scientists who tell us every day that 1.5, we are hanging on for dear life to not overshooting 1.5. In fact, we're on a trajectory that would have us overshoot 1.5 degrees of warming. I might have the luxury of not having to live through much of this, but my daughter will not, right? And so for me, this is as existential as it gets. Being in the work of moving one of the most high value, most scalable solutions to reduce emissions is a must. From an emotional level, I think of my daughter, right? That's my entry point. On credibility, for me, I like to think of, I said that, the stories of a place. I want you to be able to see something. And Kelt referenced Salem, Massachusetts. Salem, Massachusetts, talk about, maybe you close your eyes and you think of Halloween because Salem is like the Halloween capital of the world. In addition to being that, it also used to be a deep water port for tall ships that, lo and behold, in 2024, a deep water port for tall ships has huge utility for the offshore wind industry. And it's also a place where something really special happened, where environmental justice advocates came together with the municipality and with the developers to create a plan, with the unions to create a plan that benefited all involved. Kelt mentioned the community benefit agreements. And so when I want people to understand what we can unlock with offshore wind, I like to tell them a story about a place like Salem, where people have come together to do this transformative type work. Because I kind of want you to see Halloween for a second when you close your eyes, right? I want you to see a place that you can imagine and not just an abstract notion. And the other thing, when I like to talk about the data points, and Johanna, you mentioned this in your opening, off the coast of Massachusetts, where I am lucky enough to live, the offshore wind is it's one of the best places in the world for offshore wind. We have so much wind blowing all the time, especially in the times Johanna mentioned, and how we actually harness that. I want people to visualize it's blowing all day and we can hold on to this and power the state. How crazy is that, right? Like, how exciting is that? And I think that, that's what, talk about, as you can see, I talk with my hands a lot. I'm an emotional guy. But this is an important part, I think, about making it not an abstract debate and more a conversation around how do I connect with you at an empathetic level? And so I want to talk a little. So first I would say to you is, what is your personal story for why you care about offshore wind, why you're engaged in this issue of all the million things that you could be focused on in the world? Why are you here and focusing on this? And in addition to that, what are the stories you'd want to tell, right? Like that help, that you might be able to communicate that to someone else. I also just quickly, before I wrap up, wanted to talk a little bit more about audience, especially the notion of dealing with people who are opposed to us, to our, particular point of view, or perhaps cynical or asking hard questions. First of all, that is generally speaking a good thing. Right? Disagreement and cynicism are healthy parts of a democracy, and we should be encouraging people to ask hard questions and not, shutting those questions down. I like to distinguish, though, between this difference between disinformation and misinformation. Disinformation, as I contextualize it, is people who, and Sabrina mentioned, some of the coordination that's happening among fossil fuel sort of driven entities across the country. Disinformation is the intentional use of bad information for a outcome that you want, that's a part of your agenda, right? To get other people to share it and think it is real. Misinformation is very often probably the majority of what we see out there in the Facebook groups and things like that, is the genuine people who come by this somewhat genuinely, or maybe fully genuinely, who have real concerns and are parroting information or sharing information they received from somewhere else that was meant to deceive them. And so my instinct is to not scold people who are sharing misinformation. I will scold people who are sharing disinformation if they're doing it intentionally and they know they're doing it. But if it's misinformation, I would much rather find a way to empathetically persuade people that maybe their sources are not what they think they are, rather than scolding them for sharing bad information or not being smart enough to figure it out. I think that meeting people where they are and trying to be empathetic is usually where I start. That said, I want to give a really important caveat, which is I want to give everybody on this call who's doing the work of offshore wind advocacy permission to focus your energy on people that you genuinely believe are persuadable, rather than just debating anybody who wants to have that debate, because there is catharsis in debating people that do not agree with us. I would say that it may not be a good use of your time and energy to debate people all the time who will never agree on this, right? It is, sometimes we do have to say, I only have so much individual bandwidth. How do I focus my energies on people that I genuinely believe can be convinced, right? And, Sabrina talked about her experience in Barnstable. I think many of those people have genuine, real concerns. And if we treat them that way, and if we can find opportunities to go back to the notion of what vehicles we use to communicate and have face-to-face emotional conversations with people, that we might be able to bring them to a slightly different place. The last thing I'll say, and then I'll wrap with this, is that I also feel like sometimes in the advocacy space, we feel like we have to have an answer to every single question all the time. And we need to be able to have a positive, good answer to everything. And I want to also give permission for one last thing, which is to say out loud the big structural change of how we experience our energy system, how we get energy, where our energy comes from, is going to be hard. And when bad things happen, that's okay. It's not always going to be perfect, so long as the mission and the goal of what we're trying to do is indeed worthwhile. And for offshore wind, I can think of a few things that are more worthwhile. And so part of this is also giving us the ability in conversations to say to people, you know, that's a really great question. I don't know. I'm going to go get back to you on that. Or, you know what? You're right. That is something that concerns me a little bit too. And there are really hard components of this that we're going to need to work out together to get to a better place. And you know, sometimes I feel like we have to be so absolutist and we can't cede an inch. And what I would say is that part of authentic and credible communications is to be human in the way we communicate with people, and that'll go a very, very, very long way. So that was like the rapid fire version of a much broader communications training and course that I do on this topic. But really grateful for the opportunity to try to fit it into 15 minutes and share a little bit of our experience. So thanks for putting up with me and my hands flailing around all the time.
It's so great, Alex. Thank you so much for bringing your expertise to this group. And it's a perfect segue for our next piece of the webinar, which is myself and Alex and Kelt and some of the other folks who work on offshore wind advocacy recognize that we need to grow our ranks. And so we wanted to ask you all how interested you would be in doing less of a webinar and more of a small group messaging workshop where you have a chance to hone your own personal story, practice your storytelling around offshore wind, and, you know, role play some scenarios that you might encounter in your life where you might be able to talk about this and have a chance to practice some of the communication tips that Alex laid out. So I will give people, we're hoping that everyone can take this poll. So the questions are, I would be very interested in that kind of session, or I would be somewhat interested in that kind of session, or I would not be interested in that session. And if we have a critical mass, then that is something that we will invest the resources in organizing and running. So it looks like 78 out of 110 participants have taken it so far. Again, we're hoping to get up to 100% participation. And if you're not interested, honestly, just be honest. Like, you won't hurt our feelings. Or if you just can't even imagine doing something like that in your life right now, that's fine too. All right. So based on respondents so far, we have roughly 22 people who are very interested and then 51 people who are somewhat interested. So what I'll do in an email after this event is include doodle poll so that we can see about scheduling that workshop. And yeah, I'm impressed and amazed and grateful that there are 70 people who are somewhat very interested in honing your own offshore wind communication skills. So before we get into our office hours, there's one more thing that I was hoping we could do in today's session, and that is to take a shared political action. And I'm going to hand it back to Alex to tee this up.
Yes, Johanna was so kind to give me the honor of sharing Environment America's political action, which was as someone who spent a decade working for a governor. I know that they actually really do tally and pay attention to how many notes they get on different issues and topic areas. And so Environment America wanted me to share a link that I think I have here. I'll drop it into the chat, which is an opportunity for you to send a message to your governor telling them that you support offshore wind. And, you know, these things, they might sometimes seem trite or like trivial. They're not. People actually, usually our experience in politics, especially those of us working in government, is that we only hear from people when things go wrong. We want to hear people about what they're excited about and what moves them. And so if you have a minute, you can use Environment America's tool there to send a note to your governor calling for big action on offshore wind. How did I do there, Johanna? Is that good?
Grade A+. Bravo.
Awesome.
All right. With that, we're at 2:00. If you need to leave, by all means, leave. We're gonna stop the recording now and get into the office hours section where we're hoping folks will have up to 15 minutes to ask questions of our panel of experts. And like I said, as soon as we have a recording of today's webinar, I'll be posting that on our website and sending a link out to everyone who RSVP'd, as well as a scheduling link for the messaging workshop. Thank you all so much for joining us today.